Okay, everyone, we might as well make a start. So, in this lecture, what we want to do is explore the works of Talcott Parsons. Obviously, as we probably know, he had a profound contribution on the field of sociology. And really, what we want to do is really just try to touch on some of his core principles. Now, obviously, we're going to discuss this, but the focal point for Parsons was actions, human actions. And in particular, what interested him was the dichotomy, to some extent, between structure, how much influence, how much control, how much governorship does structures have on the individual and actions, and what about agency? So it's about the interplay, the relationship between structure and agency. That is a real focal point of his work. So what we're going to try to do in this lecture, and we only obviously have 50 minutes, but we want to basically articulate some of the core principles he conceived, and we're going to do that by looking at his main works, the 4 books that we have here. We'll try to dissect them and try to kind of explain a few points. So in terms of his first book, written in 1937, The Structure of Social Action, as we're going to find out, that book in many ways establishes Parsons, and in particular his kind of approach to sociological theory. And within this text, what he does that's quite unique is he engages in a synthesis where he takes the ideas, let's say, of Weber and Durkheim, and he constructs his own synthesis, his own kind of idea of the theory of action. Now, as we know, Durkheim from a couple of weeks ago, he's a structuralist. So he principally believes that individual action is superseded by structures, whether that's the social facts, institutions, the collective consciousness. These things, these forces govern agency, govern the individual. They have control over them. So in many ways, it's very much deterministic, right? And then Weber, on the other side of the spectrum, is much more about individual action and individual kind of ability to control action. So for Parsons, though, because he conducts a synthesis between these two theorists, he says, look, it's not, the individual is not entirely governed by structure, but also it's not entirely agency and individual kind of drive. So what he's focusing on is that there has to be some kind of interplay between these. So sometimes agency can be more expressed, and in other occasions structure can have more of a governing kind of role. So in essence, what he felt, action was guided by, yes, your social values, the social norms, but there was a dimension of individual goals. Your kind of self-interest, your kind of agency can be expressed through consciousness, but it's all about the interplay, right? Structure, agency. So this is a substantial contribution. The second book, The Social System, written in 1951, this in many ways is about studying how society functions as a social system. And this is very much about the classical functionalism. The idea of how does society maintain equilibrium? How does it kind of solidify? How does it gain social cohesion? So this is very much his contribution to the whole area of structural functionalism. And again, we're going to see that it's his theory of action that is quite significant in that. Just jumping to the last book, The Economy and Society. This is perhaps one of the more kind of pivotal works. The reason for that is because this is where we first discover his theory of the AGIL scheme, which we're going to talk about. Also, another salient point mentioned in this is the cybernetic hierarchy, which is another key point that we'll hopefully touch upon. So we're just going to basically, in this lecture, look at some of his major works and try to dissect the main ideas in each contribution. Okay, so the first text that we're going to look at is The Structure of Social Action. Now, if we identify the main themes, it's these main concepts that exist in the structure of social action. So what we're going to try to do, if we can, is to look at each of these points, because they are important in building Parsons' sociological theory. Okay, so the first point, the thing that he starts this book off with, is actually a critique of positivism and utilitarianism. So he states in The Structure of Social Action, a theoretical system does not merely state facts which have been observed and that logically deducible relations to other facts which have also been observed. Insofar as such a theory is empirically correct, it will also tell us what empirical facts it should be possible to observe in a given set. What he's trying to say, and his critique in particular of positivism, is that if you look at positivism seeks to basically engage in value-free observation. Any ideas what we mean by that? Value-free observation. So it's that kind of classical empirical approach. You must study the object or the subject in a way that detaches you, the researcher, from it, because you don't want to expose your bias onto the subject. So it's very much about trying to examine, measure, test in a kind of empirical way. That's value-free, right? So you're not imposing your perspective onto the situation. Now for Parsons, that works effectively in a lab where you're perhaps using the physical sciences and you're testing maybe, let's say, obesity amongst rats, and you're testing it in a controlled environment. In a controlled environment like a laboratory, you can engage in value-free judgment based on facts, based on tests. That works. Why doesn't that work when you study society? Why is it we can't take that approach, that value-free observation approach, and apply it to the study of society? Because this is what essentially Parsons is certain, that it's not effective. Why? Any ideas?
Isn't that there's too many variables to account? So
highly complex with multiple variables makes it difficult for you then to determine. But also, we as human beings are social creatures that have grown up in society. We are a product of society. We've developed our ideas, our norms, our values. We have social experience. So in essence, we have subjective knowledge of society and the interactions within it. So when we try to study an event, a phenomenon, an object, we're going to naturally have some subjective kind of influence. So the way we formulate questions, the way we might select subjects and respondents will be based on our subjective awareness of society, our experiences. So invariably, due to the complexity of society, but also the subjective nature of our own experience, we will invariably have to have some kind of subjective approach. So he doesn't accept, or this is his critique of positivism. In terms of utilitarianism, in his perspective, Parsons views this method or approach as simply, it's about human action that's driven by utility, that's driven by this basic self-interest. And because you're driven, the action is driven by utility, what happens is we produce very specific rational kind of calculations. So to summarize, what we're trying to say is, or what he's trying to say, basically utilitarianism is basically reducing human action to utility. So that's need. So take, for example, religion. If you take religion, for example, religion formed because of utility. What do we mean by that? That religion formed because of utility. So in its simplest sense, religion is a direct response to human need, i.e. human utility, for survival. So humans were dependent on nature for survival. They didn't understand, we're talking early humans, didn't understand the functionality of nature, and therefore imposed the supernatural upon it, that there had to be something controlling it, a deity. This is all grown out of human utility, human need to control their surroundings. So there's this kind of need that we have. So utilitarianism is simply about human need. So actions are just driven by human need. That's the motive. So the reasons why we do anything is just purely cost-benefit analysis, utility and need. Now for Parsons, that ignores the role of culture, the values, the social norms, all of these things that shape behavior as well. It's not just utility, it's not just need and instinct that drive us to act. So for example, let's say if you want to engage in sustainability, you see that there's an environmental crisis and you want to do your part, right? So now you engage in trying to be sustainable. Now actually if we think about it, doing this, trying to be sustainable, actually goes against aspects of your self-interest. The reason for that is because you have to do a lot of sacrifice. You have to sacrifice your time, your effort. So if you want to reduce waste and recycle and do these things, you have to take a little bit more time. And that time, therefore, is taken away from other things. So if you adopted a utility-based perspective of life, then in essence, you're wasting your time. But the reason why you're doing the action of trying to be sustainable is not because of some kind of benefit to you. You're doing it for the greater good, which is to help the environment. So you're not motivated by economic utility, you're motivated by a social value, the need to improve the environment. So what Parsons is suggesting from this is that we're not exclusively driven by utility. There is social, cultural norms that drive action. So here are elements of structure over this kind of internal, instinctual utility. So that's his kind of critique, if you will, of these two concepts. The other aspect, like I said at the intro, was the synthesis. The synthesis that then gives rise to his theory of voluntaristic theory of action. So we said, if you're looking now at Durkheim and Weber, Durkheim, as we looked at it a couple of weeks back, looked at society and said that society has this kind of moral kind of structure to it. There's a moral system, if you will. So the function of society is to keep everything in a state of balance, right? And that social order is key to the function of society. And so you have structures that govern people's behavior. So take, for example, traffic lights. What is the function of a traffic light? The traffic light has a very specific function to govern the flow of traffic and avoid accidents, right? So that's why you have traffic lights. Now, there's also a latent function of traffic lights. What would that be? If the manifest function is to control traffic or control flow of traffic and avoid accidents, what is the latent function of a traffic light? Any idea? So one might argue that a latent function of traffic lights is actually fostering collective discipline. So let's just say I'm driving along at 2 a.m. at night. There's no cars. There's no issue of flow of traffic. There's no risk of accident. And there's a traffic light that hits red. I stop. Why? Because the law states it. So my agency, which is if I had the choice, I would just go through the red light. There's no harm to others. It's 2 a.m. at night. But yet I stop because there is that law. So the structure is influencing my behavior. The law, the structure, is influencing my action at 2 a.m. when I stop at the traffic light. So we can see the kind of overriding impact of structure and system on the individual. Then you have obviously Weber, which we talked about several weeks ago. Obviously for Weber, the role of values relates to this kind of thing of rationality and individualism. So the rise of the Protestant ethic and capitalism reflects that. But we don't want to dwell on that. So, okay, the significance then is from Parsons. So he's taken this very deterministic view, Durkheim, structuralism, and he's got Weber's kind of individual rationalism, right? So what does he do with these two things is construct his voluntaristic theory of action from it. So what he says by this is, in essence, like I said at the beginning, if we take actions, as I said, are not entirely governed by structure and the predetermined by the governing structures, but also we're not entirely free in terms of our agency, right? So what happens is individuals make choices within a specific social or cultural framework of norms and values. So say, for example, you have an individual, all right, and that individual has a degree of agency to make a choice, but then there are the norms and values that govern it. So it's an interplay between these elements. So take, for example, let's say, for example, you have a student who's finishing his A-levels and he's trying to make a decision of what career path to take, right? Should I go into journalism, become a doctor? What should I do? Now, there's a degree of agency in his decision making that he basically wants his personal choice, right? With his personal interest, his personal choice. That's his agency. What would be the other social or norms and values and other social factors that might influence his decision? Someone wanting to choose what career path. So you've got parental expectation, you've got maybe peers that might influence, and then you have also the market, what jobs are perhaps in the market that are popular. So I'll give you another example of that, or similar to that. Many years ago, when I went to university, I started at university doing a degree in computer science. Now, I did my A-levels in computer science, and then I didn't want to go into it at university, but because my parents influencing, they were suggesting, look, South Asian parents, the job that you do has to have some kind of vocational connection, right? So you've got to go into something like law or doctor or medicine. And if you can't get into those, okay, something like computer science, there's going to be supposedly a direct job out of it. Also at the time, computer science was a really big thing. Everyone was going into computer programming, software engineering. My friends all went into that. So basically, you got my peers influencing, parents influencing, and the job market influencing. So my agency in the decision to take computer science at university was minimal to those social forces. Then I went to university to study computer science, and it lasted 2 weeks because it was terrible. I hated it. So basically I switched to philosophy and then basically carried on with that. So what we have is two decisions. The first was driven by structure and less agency, and the second decision to switch was driven more by my agency than the norms and other values. So I didn't care that my friends were doing computer science. I didn't really care then what my parents expected, and I didn't really care what the job market was. So it was purely on a lot of agency. So we can see then what he's trying to say, Parsons, that there is this aspect of voluntaristic theory of action, that our actions are an interplay between the structural forces and our own agency. Okay, are there any questions so far? Okay, the other point that he mentions in this work, and there's a lot of theories and there's a lot of ideas, and I know we're going through them relatively quickly, but the other aspect he talks about is this idea of the analytical framework of action. So basically what Parsons is saying is that there are four components required to understand the individual act, the actions that we perform. The first is the actor. The actor is obviously the individual or the group. The individual that performs the action is the actor. The means is the resources that are available for a particular goal, right? And the end is basically the end goal that you want to basically reach. What is the end point of the action, right? So often this is guided by what your goal is. Now, the other aspect then is this Normative orientation. Any idea what that is? So, what Parsons is saying here is that the values and the norms of society will shape, in many ways, the kind of the means and the ends that are done. So, okay, let's look at that in terms of an example to make sense of it. Let's take voter behavior as an example, right? Election time comes and you have the actor. The actor is the person going to vote, right? So the actor is the voter, right? So that's the example. Now the means is that they're going to basically take their time and effort to go to the polling station. So that's the means. And the ends is basically them wanting to elect their favorite candidate or party. All right? So you've got the actor, the voter, the means is the time and the effort, the ends is to elect a particular candidate or party. What is then, in that scenario of voter behavior, normative orientation? So we said, remember, it was the values, the norms that shape the choice of the means and the ends. So the motivation for this person, the actor, to go and vote at the polling station during the election time is upheld by or underpinned by this normative orientation, which is belief in perhaps democracy. So belief in democracy is the normative orientation. It's the social norms and values that motivate this person to go vote. If this person hypothetically was an anarchist, then they might not go and vote because they don't believe in democracy. So in essence, it's that thing that really then connects the action together. The other point that he makes in relation to all of this is this issue of the institutionalization of norms. So the institutionalization of norms arises from the systemic organization of individual and collective actions. So if we talk about this aspect now, according to Parsons, if you look at institutions, remember he's still coming from an aspect of functionalism, institutions embed norms and values within society. So how do institutions embed norms and values into society? So the obvious example would be, let's say, the education system. We know the education system has a very manifest function to impart knowledge and educate young people, right, within a particular syllabus. Now, there is major latent functions that actually come from the education system, which is in essence preparing students, young people, for society. So it's preparing them and equipping them with particular kind of skills and tools to integrate into society. So it's about basically preparing them for social roles in society. So this is kind of another important aspect that he's talking about. A couple of other points. So in the book, The Structure of Social Action, two other important points that he highlights. The role of values in social integration and the methodological individualism. So we'll try to kind of be brief. Now, the role of values in social integration. So again, shared values in any society has a specific function. Shared values seek to maintain specific social cohesion, right? It gives us a sense of identity, it gives us a sense of collective purpose. So take, for example, let's say in America. In America they have Independence Day, right? So Independence Day is a collective shared value. It's actually very symbolic, and it builds how does it build, let's say, social cohesion? So America, you've got America, Independence Day. How does that build shared values in American society? Or in what way does it do that? So it does that through things like patriotism. So it encourages, fosters, cultivates patriotism, which is important because that connects the citizen to the state, right? That reinforces your relationship that you are an American citizen. America as a state upholds a certain ideological view, the freedom and liberty, and independent state is kind of recognizing that. So it's not just you that is celebrating that day, it's your neighbors, it's your family, it's your friends, it's the whole of society that basically honor American independence. So it generates a shared value, it's a shared act. So in essence, the role of values helps integrate people. You are part of this society. It makes you feel part of it. It gives you your sense of who you are, your identity, and your national identity, importantly. Another aspect is this idea of methodological individualism. So in many ways, Parsons rejects the idea of looking at individual behavior without any kind of social context. What does he mean by that? Well, we said that he takes this kind of view that there's structure and there's agency. What does that mean? That basically he's rejecting individual behavior without any social context. Any expression of agency is still dependent upon social context. So you as an individual are still embedded within society. You interact with friends, you interact with family, you interact with work. That's a social context. Family is a social context. School and university is a social context. So the expression of agency is always going to be manifest in a social context, right? So there's never a scenario where the individual is detached from a particular social context. So the social context governs the individual in that way. So for example, let's say if you've got a hospital and you have a doctor, right? Now a doctor he's not just operating, i.e. his actions, based on his personal choices. Rather, there's his personal choice or his agency, but then he's also governed by the hospital regulations, ethical frameworks, as well as the general health system, right? So, for example, he can't just come in on a Tuesday and say, you know what, I'm going to work 3 hours today, I'm just feeling a bit tired, I'm going to go. There's expectations that he has to put in a 12-hour shift. So, in essence, you're not just driven by exclusively, in a bubble, your free choice, your agency. There are other things that connect outside of you within a social context that basically influence your actions and your choices. And this is what basically Parsons is suggesting. Are there any questions so far? Okay, I know we're kind of running through this quickly. Okay, so moving to now the second text, major work, The Social System, written in 1951. Now, Parsons, within this text, essentially conceptualizes society as a system, a fully functional, interdependent system. Now, what's important within this system is that this system has functioning parts, and that's what basically makes it function. So the functioning parts are things like the institutions, the norms and values, but also the roles. The roles that individuals have in society is important to maintaining equilibrium, to make that system function. So if we continue with the healthcare scenario, the healthcare example, if you're looking at the healthcare system, right, you've got different parts, right? So the healthcare system, you'll have doctors and nurses, you'll have patients that have obviously complex needs, you're going to have management, you're going to have also government regulation, okay? Now, all of these things, I know there's other bits like orderlies and other things, but all of this working as a system with interconnected parts, so these things are all interconnected. These parts have their job, role, and they interconnect. That interconnectedness creates functionality, creates equilibrium. Now, what happens if this system encounters a major crisis? So like COVID-19 happened, that puts immense pressure, challenge, and disruption on the functionality of this system. So now roles, and we have to have adaptation to counteract a crisis. And that's why the system works as a whole, to counteract these things. It tests the strength of the system. If the system is not strong enough to deal with COVID-19, and we have a huge surge of patients, that puts pressures on these aspects, and the whole system can collapse. Okay, are there any questions so far? Okay, another aspect that he talks about within this is the idea of pattern variables. So what Parsons is essentially saying is that if you look at the social roles that we have, they're counterbalanced by dichotomies. So there are 5 dichotomies when it comes to social roles in society. So he says basically these are the 5 different social roles. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but the first one, for example, you have affectivity versus affective neutrality. So in essence, you could have in one position an agent that is very emotionally expressed, while in the other you'll have restraint. So you see that there is this kind of dichotomy between these two emotional states and actions. And you can run through each of these that has these kind of things. There is this kind of perhaps positive and negative aspect. Now, the best way to illustrate this is through an example. So let's say you have the workplace and compare it with the family. Now, these are two very different social systems, right? Much smaller, much larger depending on the workplace. Now, if you look at the workplace, the roles in the workplace, in many ways, are considered, you could consider them basically, typically, universal. So, let's just say you'll have, I don't know, the accounts, HR, management, the employers, yeah, or employees. Now that kind of universality can apply to any type of different business, different businesses in size and so forth. So the workplace, the roles have universality in terms of what Parsons is talking about. But in the family, we would say that there is more particularness in the family structure. Now, why is that? So the roles are driven more by particularities, if you will. And in the family, so you've got basically particularity and they're ascribed roles, right? Because you have a hierarchy of father, mother, children, while it's slightly different in the dynamic of work. Also, work is much more basically achievement orientated, right? So in work, it's about your performance, productivity, and you can gain basically promotion via that. Okay, moving to the next text. Towards a general theory of action. In this text, if you look at what he's saying here, he's saying basically action systems cannot be fully understood without understanding their interrelation with cultural systems and personality systems, as the three are functionally interdependent. What's he trying to say here? So in this text, what he's trying to do is engage in a bit of interdisciplinary kind of study. Yeah. So what he argues is that basically some of the ideas related to social action that he conceives might actually cut across different boundaries. So it can cut across cultures, societies, and personalities. And one of the examples that they actually look at in the text is religion. Now, if you look at religion, religion cuts across the culture, the social, and the individual or the personalities, all right? So if you take first the individual or the personal, religion basically gives precepts about how the individual practitioner might worship God, or the individual relationship with God. So that's that kind of spiritual connection to God. So you might have prayer and these things. So religion dictates the individual kind of sphere, that connection with God. If we look then at the cultural aspect, religion has multiple expressions of symbols, right? These shared symbols. So like in Christianity, the cross is a significant symbol. It expresses something, and it basically doesn't matter if you're a Christian in different parts of the world, that symbol means something. It carries meaning. So for example, any Christian around the world will know that this reflects Christ as Saviour. All right, so he died for humanity's sins, and he is the Saviour. So that is a symbol that provides shared understanding of that kind of particular thing. So in essence, religion provides shared values, shared symbols. The social aspect of religion is basically things like congregational worship. That builds community, that builds a sense of identity, that builds connection. So what they're trying to say is that these things manifest across different kind of boundaries, this issue of the theory of action. Now, if we look at the other point that he mentions, on the goal-orientated nature of actions, the unit act involves an actor in a situation with a given end or goal in relation to which certain conditions and means are present. So what's he trying to say here? Now, if we look at this is kind of referred to as unit act theory. So basically it suggests human actions, if we look at human actions, they're often kind of goal-orientated, right? Now, they're goal-orientated, but they will always involve the means as well as you've got the social norms and values and the social context. So those influence. So for example, let's just take an example. Let's say you've got a student who has his exams coming up, all right? Now the action is what? The action is studying for the exam, right? So the action is to study for the exam. Now the other aspects you'll have is obviously the goal, which is to pass, right? So the student wants to obviously pass the exam. Then you have the means. The means is obviously the time and other resources like textbooks and other research that you do at the library, right? Then you have norms. Okay, so what do we mean by norms here? Because norms often will create a level of adherence. So that individual action. So we can see, look, the action of studying for an exam is quite clear. You have a particular goal to pass. The means is the time and the other resources like textbooks. But what do we mean by norms? That the student will also adhere to a set of norms. So in the exam room, why won't that person cheat is because maybe there is that social norm that cheating is not allowed, that you have to have integrity in academia, and therefore they won't cheat. So that's an expression also of the norms that will influence the whole process of actions. So again, it's not just driven by the kind of individual agency. Okay, we're running out of time. So the final book, Economy and Society. Now, if we look at this text, Economy and Society, Parsons writes about it. He states that basically this volume is designed as a contribution to the synthesis of theory in economics and sociology. Simply, what he wants to do is basically define and understand the relationship between the economic system and the wider social system. So, in essence, what he wants to do is explore the phenomenon of subsystems. Now, if you look at society, we have different and very important subsystems. We have economics, we have politics, we have the cultural, we have the social. All of those aspects influence individual actions, right? So in a modern society, in a modern state, you'll have the economic system that governs, the markets, banks, But also, what does the economic system do? It also deals with resource allocation. Now, if you look at another department, like the government and the politics, that will deal with law and enforcement and policy, right? So what he wants to do is try to understand how these subsystems interrelate. Okay, so within that context, he asks a very important question. Why is it that societies hold together? How is it that our society that we exist in is bound together and it maintains itself through continuity and it creates stability? Well, for Parsons, the reasons for this is something that he termed dynamic equilibrium. Any ideas what he means by this? So, in essence, this is going to be introducing his AGIL scheme, but in essence, what he means by dynamic equilibrium, as we said, society is immensely complex, right? So you have, as we said, individuals in society, but you also have the social norms and the social values and the institutions. Now, this is all trying to balance out the needs of society, right? So the institutions are there to serve the needs of people, right? So we basically have to have all of this balanced out. So in essence, what dynamic equilibrium is about is balancing out the various variables, the various kind of issues that we have, forces in society, and create a kind of stability. So for example, let's say, for example, you have an economic crisis in society. Let's say inflation hits and everything skyrockets. Now that's going to impact everyone in society. All the individuals will be affected by inflation, right? If everything starts to go up, it's going to mean that we're going to have less, we're going to struggle. So that requires the balancing out of other institutional forces to maintain stability. So other forces have to come in and balance things out when you have a crisis like that. Okay, again, moving quickly, structural functionalism, we've kind of touched upon it. Structural functionalism is this idea that everything in society has to have a function. So the institutions, like we said, serve a particular need. Like the human body has a function, the internal organs. Similarly, banks, the police, the government, the economics, it all has a function that serves human need. And this again needs to be balanced out. So everything has a function. We've talked about that. Okay. In terms of the next point related to action, I think in terms of this point, action can be obviously described in three dimensions that society needs to integrate into social order. There's the cultural, there's the social system, and there's personalities. I think I'm going to skip this point because we've kind of touched on it and just get onto the main point because I know we're running out of time. So it's worth us jumping ahead and looking at, in essence, the AGIL model, which is basically, for Parsons, he identifies 4 essential functions of social systems. So any social system must perform these 4 fundamental functions. Now the first is adaptation. So adaptation to the environment, right? So if you look at any system, any social system, it must have inbuilt within it the ability to adjust and respond to situations like a crisis or change. So you might have new technology come in, like AI. How does the system deal with that? How do you maintain order when new technologies come about? And the key is adaptation. So if you take an example, I don't know if many of you will remember this, but Nokia at one time, especially when I was younger, your age, Nokia was the largest mobile phone company. And everyone had a Nokia, pretty much a Nokia like a brick phone. And they controlled the market. They were the most popular mobile phone company by far. However, they failed to adapt to smartphone technology when that started to come. And as a result, they basically didn't respond to the market trend, and it gave an opportunity for companies like Apple to come in and establish itself and pretty much take over. So Apple, why is it still one of the leaders in mobile phone technology, is because it constantly adapts to the challenges of the market. It innovates, constantly innovating, generating new kind of phones and technology. So in essence, the system has to have built within it adaptation. The other aspect is that it's got to be goal orientated, has to achieve a specific goal. So in essence, systems must have the ability to set goals, right? And basically must, in many ways, mobilize resources, which is vital, right? So take, for example, schools. We said this before, right? Schools have a goal, right? Go to any school. Let's go to any primary school. One of their key goals in a primary school is literacy rates, right? So there is a specific age where all children should be literate, right? That's a goal that you have. So, okay, if that's your goal, then you will break down what are the resources and means required to achieve that. You'll need teachers, you'll need technology, you'll need textbooks, all of those things to achieve that, right? So the system has to be goal-orientated. The third aspect is integration, right? So integration, if we look at that, is about, in many ways, establishing rules and norms for resolving conflicts. So in any democratic system, you'll have a set of systems that protect as well as resolve disputes. So for example, you've got, let's say, laws and regulations. So let's say, for example, like I said, what stops me at 2 a.m. at a red light? It's because the law. I don't want to go against the law. So that puts pressure on us to conform. So that governs our actions. But also, the wider aspect of the legal system is that it resolves disputes and it enforces law. That again maintains a sense of justice and it creates cohesion in society, right? The last point, which is latent pattern maintenance, is the idea that basically because what he's talking about here is the whole issue of value patterns shared by all or most individuals. That has this reinforcing effect. So take, for example, in America, you have Thanksgiving. I think Thanksgiving is coming up, or it was just a few days ago. Thanksgiving in America promotes shared values. How it does that is by reinforcing things like gratitude and community. So in essence, this helps with latent pattern maintenance because it's reinforcing a set of shared values that is collectively upheld. So that helps with the kind of other aspects. Okay, I know we've run out of time. I think we've generally covered everything that we needed to. But again, it was very quick, so I apologize. Next Friday, we're going to be looking at symbolic interactionalism, so there might be some touch on with that.